Okay, that's how I knew it, right?
So, I started this new
Yeah, sounds great.
Hello.
this new master's program that's
I think we're ready to start the next session.
they have been really great.
Sounds good. Good.
A few stragglers coming in. Okay, my name is Craig Borowiak. I'm a associate professor of political science at Haverford College. I'll be the chairing this session, this panel, this keynote panel. But to introduce the panel, we have Alan Greenberger. Alan Greenberger is the Deputy Mayor of Economic Development of Philadelphia. He's the Director of the Department of Commerce in Philadelphia. He joined the administration 4 years ago. After 34 years in private practice as an architect, he's been a resident of Philadelphia for 38 years, and he's here to welcome you to the city and tell you and introduce the panel.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Yeah, I learned that in the political world, you're always supposed to say, yes, good afternoon. I've been a member of, since I live in the East Mount Airy section of Philadelphia, and since living there now, 14 years ago, we've been a member of the Weaver's Way Food Co-op, and like every time I intersect with Weaver's, I'm overdressed for the occasion, and today's no different, especially since I saw the mayor just leave. I thought, man, I am really overdressed. I wish I could do that, but yeah, that's not what you do when you get to travel. First of all, for those of you who are not from Philadelphia, welcome to Philadelphia. Really happy to have you here, and thanks to Drexel for hosting this. I have to say, at first I thought I was going out to West Philly, and when I realized it was Drexel, so-called Drexel Center City, and a mere 2 blocks from my office, I thought this was great. I'll do more things here anytime. Major developments in any city, major developments always grab headlines. It's sort of an inevitability about life and kind of how the media work. But in a time now of cities everywhere being really constrained, limited resources, we really rely more and more on the efforts of citizens to come together and do things on their own, ideally with our support. Sometimes it's financial support, sometimes it's moral support, sometimes it's technical support, but support nonetheless. But people organizing to do things on their own is absolutely critical to the health of cities. We can't do this ourselves, and I think people, as a result of the resource and the economic dilemmas that we find ourselves in, I think people have really come to understand that. Now, a lot of the people represented here today, Weaver, certainly Mariposa, my old neighborhood, by the way, South Philly Food Co-op, these are groups that have some real long standing and have been doing what you all are interested in for a very long time. And then there are a lot of startup ones, but we see more and more of it, whether it's in the form of food co-ops or in the form of business improvement districts or cleanup campaigns, business associations. These are all part of how cities and neighborhoods take care of themselves. In my department, in Commerce, we have something called the Office of Neighborhood Economic Development, and I don't know whether you've met her. Where is she? She's somewhere over there. Thank you. Karen Fagley, and one of our senior staff members, Jim Flaherty, I see is over there. Anybody else, Karen, that I'm missing? Where's Dennis? Anyway, several of our staff members over here. Karen is the director of the Office of Neighborhood and Economic Development, which means that she's working with businesses like co-ops with regularity. She's working on programs that we have in commercial corridors, and rather extensive programs that are actually doing grant money, not a lot of it, but grant money for business associations, cleanup programs, business organizations, technical support. These are the ways we directly support the kind of businesses that exist in neighborhoods and the kind of interface that we have. So let's take, for instance, Mariposa as an example. We worked with them last year. They're out in West Philadelphia, as I said, my old neighborhood of 16 years, to help them sort of open their new store at 48th in Baltimore. What did we do? We provided them with storefront improvement grants and helped them fit out their new premises. Weaver's Way has a farm not very far from the 2 stores that they run up in the northwest part of the city, and we discovered quite by accident, or unhappily for them, that they were running their farm not with the completely right zoning, let's put it that way, in place. Although it was great. I mean, it's a great farm on a piece of parkland, but they needed some legal help. We sort of discovered it late in the game. We worked with them directly and the people who were representing them to get the farm zoning straightened out, which it got. No interruption of services. They're happily doing what they're doing on a very nice couple of acres. So now, not only, to go back to Mariposa a second, not only is that store providing high quality and locally sourced fresh food in an underserved neighborhood, it's turning an old bank building into a thriving grocery. We're returning properties to good use. We're revitalizing an important piece of commercial corridor. That was my old neighborhood. That commercial corridor was pretty sleepy. It wasn't nothing, but it was kind of sleepy, and it has evolved, possibly since my absence. Maybe there's some cause and effect. Over the last 14 years into a really thriving commercial corridor, and things like Mariposa and food co-ops in general are very, very much part of that. The original Weaver's Way store in Mount Airy, which has been there for decades, is not only a place where you can buy fresh food, it is truly a de facto community center. It's where every politician who has to campaign in Mount Airy shows up to meet people. Half the time that people spend in Weaver's Way, which is a very tight little operation, you're in the aisles talking to your neighbors and friends about whatever, and occasionally actually shopping in between. It's just a great thing. And what's grown up around it is equally great, because now it not only has its little branch for pet stores, there's a coffee shop, there has been one store that has been various things from dance studio to ecological products store, but there's a whole network of things that grow up around it. And coincidentally and happily, it's right across the street from a public school, so it kind of makes the picture really complete in a terrific way. I also want to acknowledge working with Drexel to ensure that we're all helping to create a supportive environment for co-ops in the city, providing the kind of technical assistance that's needed, and the training to those looking to get started, because the hardest part is really getting started and then sustaining yourself through these kind of early periods when you're at your most fragile economic base before things kind of take hold. We do that through Karen's office. We're always looking to figure out new ways to do it and support the citizens of the city, because this is ultimately about neighborhood revitalization. And you all, whether you're in Philadelphia or you're in another city, you all are part of the eyes, ears, hands, money, sweat equity, and commitment and willpower to make our neighborhoods better. So this is, it may not grab the headlines, but this is among the most important things that we quietly do day in, day out with you. We're absolutely delighted that this panel's here today, that the conference is here in general, and certainly for those of you in Philadelphia, we look forward to working more and more with you on these great efforts at neighborhood improvements. I have to go now to the next appointment. I'm a little overscheduled, where I will be more appropriately dressed, I suppose. But thank you all for being here. Delighted to have you here in Philadelphia. Enjoy this great panel.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. I wanted to say just a couple words before introducing the individual panelists. First, to reflect a little bit about the structure of the conference and the different panels. Gar Alperovitz this morning challenged us, invited us to think grandly with a broad vision of what the cooperative economy could become. We heard more of that from Mayor Soglin, but if you actually looked at the individual panels, we broke off the individual panels to focus on either individual case studies or thematics, breaking them into thematics, so food co-ops, worker cooperatives, energy cooperatives. And so one point of these keynote sessions, including this keynote panel, is to come back together and try to push ourselves, as Gar might say, stretch ourselves to think beyond our parochialisms, because I think there's a tendency within the cooperative movement to become parochial, both parochial in the sense of one's own city, but it also in the sense of one's own sector or one's own cooperative. I know that's against, so the cooperative principles are pushing us in that way, and the invitation is to do so even further. I do want to suggest that there is another parochialism that we have to be cognizant of, and that is the national one, and the parochialism of the cooperative movement itself. I think it's important to understand how the cooperative movement is situated within a broader economy, call it a solidarity economy, call it a new economics economy, call it a social economy, that there might be ways that the cooperative economy can build connections with other sectors that are at least along the same, operating in the same progressive principles. The point is working transnationally. This is the international year of the cooperative. So we're building connections between cities and across the nation. It is also valuable to think beyond the nation. There is a global movement for these kinds of initiatives, and part of the challenge is to make them visible to one another, so that we can see what we are doing in multiple senses. One way to make it visible is to create maps. There's some maps that I and a few other people help produce out in the hallway. I hope you take a look at them. That they locate these cooperatives in the demographics of the two cities, but also to make visible in a different sense of mapping. That is to generate narratives, to give the narratives and make them public. And there are several mapping initiatives and self-study initiatives going on in many different fronts, many different cities, and it's going to require us to cooperate with the people, with one another, as we try to self-study and make these things visible. Okay, I want to start by introducing Steve Dubb. Steve Dubb is Research Director of the Democracy Collaborative at the University of Maryland, where he has worked since 2004. He is the principal author of several documents, including a book called Linking Colleges to Communities, Engaging the University of Community Development, and a book called Building Wealth, the New Asset-Based Approach to Solving Social and Economic Problems. He's published on especially the relationship between university, education, and the community, as well as on the issue of green jobs. As importantly, maybe more importantly, he conducted the initial strategic planning that led to the development of the Evergreen Cooperative Initiative in Cleveland, which we heard about this morning. He currently continues to assist in efforts to adopt that model. He's become a sort of a spokesperson for the model around the country. Prior to his work at the collaborative, Dubb was executive director of the North American Students of Cooperation, a U.S. and Canadian nonprofit association, and he has a PhD in political science. So let me introduce them one by one, so I give them their fair due. So Steve?
All right, thanks. Thanks for the introduction, and I should caution that all these projects are done in partnerships and teams, and certainly I would be remiss if I didn't mention Ted Howard, who's taken a leading role in the Evergreen Project. So I have worked with Ted on that project since 2007, but he actually moved to Cleveland to implement that project, and my role has been to try to spread the model to other cities, so I've been working on that. So a lot to cover and not a lot of time, so I'll try to talk a little bit about community wealth and what we mean by that, a little bit about history of co-ops, a little bit about the scale of the co-op movement as it is, and you do have in the conference guide a list of there actually is significant scale in the co-op movement at present, and even more so if we think about it internationally. The co-op 300, Global 300 have $1.6 trillion in assets, the 300 largest co-ops in the world, which would make co-ops, if you made them into a country, 7th or 8th largest economy in the world. So fairly large movement that we have. 1.2 billion people worldwide are members of cooperatives. And then talk a little bit about Evergreen and some of the principles behind Evergreen, because Evergreen itself is an experiment, but it's an important experiment, part of a family of experiments really going on to try to reconnect cooperatives to critical problems of community economic development. So first, community wealth building, what do we mean by that? This is a term that we developed back in 2004, 2005. Other people use other terms, solidarity economy, social economy. You can use a lot of different terms. But the idea was to cite Kretzmann and McKnight again as John Knight got cited by the mayor from Madison just a little while ago. It's an asset-based community development approach where you look at the assets in the community and you try to build from those. And there's a whole plethora of different types of ways of building wealth in low-income communities in the United States and abroad. Everything from community development corporations, community development financial institutions, TRF being a very important funder of the Food Trust, for instance, in Pennsylvania here. Cooperatives, employee stock ownership plan companies, social enterprise. There's a whole gamut of different approaches, and we do, to use an overused word, tend to think in silos. So our role is to try to break those down through our research, and I encourage you to visit the Democracy Collaborative's web portal, community-wealth.org, which tries to track these things. And then I also have an invitation to email me, and I think, I don't know if my email is in the program guide or not, but it's sgdub@yahoo.com. And if you have places that you think we should be featuring on that website that aren't featured, please let me know. Okay, so what is community wealth building? Well, basically the idea, as I said, is to build on these different tools, use these different tools to build on existing assets and build wealth, to try to reshape the ownership of assets, to displace the corporate concentration of wealth that has occurred in this country that Dr. Alperovitz talked about this morning, and do that, by creating businesses that can sort of take out the existing corporate structures. That's the vision over time, doing that from the ground up and from the bottom up. And in particular, it's based on stopping the leakage of dollars from communities and reinvesting in our own communities, so that we have stable tax bases, so that we have our own economies, so that we don't spend $70 billion a year, as we do presently with state and local tax incentives, to support corporations. Walmart alone gets $1 billion a year in tax abatements from state and local governments across the United States. So, you could call Walmart a welfare cheat if you wanted. So that is their current business model. So some of that money, some of those TIF dollars, some of those different economic development dollars could be redirected towards cooperatives. It's nice to see that some of that at least is happening in Philadelphia. Probably not as much as people would like, but at least it sounds like they were supporting some projects there. So co-ops have a long history. You could really trace co-ops back to the beginning of time. I won't do that. The modern cooperative movement started in 1844 in Rochdale, and as some of you know, I'm sure in this audience, Rochdale is in the middle of industrial England. It is literally today a suburb of Manchester. Can't be more industrial than that. And wages as of 1842, 2 years before the Rochdale Co-op, had fallen to 1/3 the national average. And the national average in 1842 wasn't that high. And the initial Rochdale Co-op was about whole food. It was literally about having unadulterated food and whole milk as opposed to watered down milk. And 28 pioneers got together, and they each had to contribute a pound, £1 to become owners of that co-op, which was a lot of money back then. So people did it on an installment. There's 240 pence to a pound at the time, did a tuppence a week. And after 120 weeks, you would fully subscribed as an owner of the Rochdale Co-op. That co-op today is become something, it's interesting. The mayor, Soglin from Madison again, he mentioned that wouldn't be interesting if there was a national food chain that there's a cooperative. That's a cooperative. Well, in England, in fact, there is. It's called the Cooperative Group. It has 4.5 million members, 123,000 employees. It's one of the largest supermarkets. That's the original Rochdale Cooperative. It still exists, obviously based on mergers from different co-ops and so forth. But it's a very different model than the case study of the 8 food co-ops we saw here. So just something to think about. The United States also had a long history of co-ops in the 19th century. The Knights of Labor wasn't just a labor movement, it was also a co-op movement. And 500 cooperative workshops and factories opened in the 25 years after the Civil War. So the same people who were organizing trade unions were also organizing co-ops. This wasn't just a 19th century thing, this was a 20th century thing. If you look at Cooperative Services Incorporated in Detroit, if you look at Amalgamated Housing and Co-op City in New York City, those were supported by labor unions. At some point, There was a separation that happened, and now there's a movement back towards rebuilding that, but we should remember that history. Today in the United States, of course, 3.1 trillion in assets. One thing I just want to point, though, I want to make about scale is there's a lot of places where there isn't scale, but there are places that there are. It was interesting. Wouldn't it be great if there was a co-op hardware network in the United States? Well, it so happens that the 9th largest co-op in the United States is something called Ace Hardware, 3.5 billion in annual revenues. So it's interesting that, A, that's not a case study here at this conference, but it's also, we just got Ace Hardware in the community I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland. But they're not integrated into a community building movement in the way that Dr. Alperovitz was talking about. That's a challenge, re-educating co-op members of existing cooperatives as to the cooperative values and making those central. So scale is a challenge for the co-op movement, but 3 trillion in assets, 850,000 employees, $75 billion in wages. That's a good starting point for a movement, it's particularly if you combine it with other forms of community development. But there is a need for internal education. There's also a need for external education. There are hundreds of colleges across the United States that teach social enterprise. If you went to Europe and you learned social enterprise, you'd learn about cooperatives. In fact, that's probably the principle. In fact, if you said the word social enterprise in Europe, they probably, people's mind, they'd be thinking co-op. That's not true in the United States. And so that's a challenge that we need to face. And there's a challenge to meet the needs, to link co-ops to community economic development, to actually building wealth. And a brief historical segue. I think it's worth mentioning a few of the reasons what happened. Why do we not think of co-ops initially as the way to do community development? And I have a couple hypotheses, I guess. One is that in the Great Society programs, nonprofits were favored. And so the whole community development corporation network that formed, there were no community development corporations back in 1965. Today there are 4,600. That's because of the Great Society. So co-ops were sort of, if you wanted to do community development, you were told in the 60s and 70s, do it through a nonprofit primarily. On the co-op side, we know there were issues with that co-ops, at least in certain sectors, such as food co-ops and housing co-ops, at least in the student housing co-op sector where I come from, were focused on, became more associated with the counterculture. Well, that counterculture was largely a white counterculture, and that also led to a divorce from, if you will, movements of color and the civil rights movement that focused more on a nonprofit direction. And then, as I mentioned before, the labor movement moved away. They forgot that, the labor movement is a movement, and it's not just about the workplace, but about people's lives outside the workplace. So that's being rediscovered today, but there's a rebuilding process going on. So that brings us to Evergreen and an effort here. And Evergreen is based on a fairly simple concept, which is that we're trying to create a network of cooperatives that employ worker owners in low-income neighborhoods that can meet the procurement needs of area institutions, hospitals, universities, the largest employers of the communities. Worth noting that universities and hospitals are primarily nonprofit or state-owned institutions. They have a public purpose. The mission of a university or hospital is not to maximize profit, it's to maximize education or health. And so that corresponds with supporting the community. But again, just like many of the large co-ops have forgotten that co-op values are somewhat different than corporate values, so have boards of trustees at universities and hospitals. So there's a re-education process going on. What are the businesses? Very briefly, there's a laundry. 12,000 to 13,000 square feet, employ 50 worker owners at full capacity, and create about, and it's uses about 8/10 of a gallon of water per pound of laundry instead of 3 to 4 gallons as a conventional laundry, so it's environmentally efficient as well. There's a solar and weatherization business, and there's a greenhouse that's going to open this fall, 3¼ acres under glass, Most of these businesses are designed to hire about 25 to 75 people. We hope to have about 500 people in 10 businesses within the next 5 years. And this is an incubator model. We're dealing with neighborhoods where the median household income is $18,500. You're employed initially as a probationary employee. After 6 months, you're voted into the cooperative, and then there's a deduction from your payroll to buy your ownership share. Our goal is to have that ownership share be worth about $65,000 after 8 years. So that's a very sketched version of Evergreen. As I said, we're not the only ones doing this work. There's Wages, Women's Actions to Gain Economic Security in the San Francisco Bay Area that's developed a network of house cleaning co-ops with primarily employing Latino women. There's Center for Working Life in Brooklyn. The steelworkers have announced a partnership with Mondragon, bringing back that full circle, the idea that labor unions are representing workers in the community as well as at the workplace. And so I think I'll close with a quote from Leo Gerard. He's the president of the Steelworkers Union. Brief biographical note: for a couple of years I worked for Leo Gerard at the Steelworkers Union. And he said this back on last March. Too often we have seen Wall Street hollow out companies by draining their cash and assets, and hollowing out communities by shutting jobs and shuttering plants. We need a new business model that invests in workers and invests in communities. And ultimately, that's the bottom line. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, our second speaker is Jessica Gordon-Nemhard. She's Associate Professor of Community Justice and Social Economic Development in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College in the CUNY system. She's an affiliate scholar at the Center for the Study of Cooperatives at the University of Saskatchewan. She's a political economist. Her specialty has been in community economics and cooperative economies. Her research, pioneering research I should add, has been on African American cooperatives, measuring the impact of co-ops in communities, particularly worker co-ops and credit unions. She's a co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative, as well as of the Eastern Conference of Workplace Democracy and the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. She's a charter member of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, and as well as the New York City Network of Worker Cooperatives. She's a member of the Federation of Southern Co-ops and the Canadian Association for the Study of Cooperatives. She's a board member of the Association of Cooperative Education, the Grassroots Economic Organizing Collective, this is the GEO newsletter for those who know it, and Organizing Neighborhood Equity DC, amongst several other projects. So Jessica, please come.
I got it. Oh, I got it from up there. Yeah.
Good afternoon. So, there's a lot to say, not enough time to say it, so I'll do the same thing as Steve. I'll try not to talk too fast, but I probably will. Even though I spent 20 years in DC, I'm still a New Yorker. So let's get to it, but I did want to say that I'm really excited that you guys are doing this, and one of the things I'll probably forget at the end, so I'll say it now, which is that the Eastern Conference for Workplace Democracy, which I'm a founder and I'm still the treasurer of, actually just voted recently to come to your town next summer. You guys will want to keep following this up by attending and actually being on the host committee. And, you know, we like to do tours. We like to combine as much with what's going on in the city that we're at as possible. And so just keep in mind that we'll be contacting you and that we hope that you'll come out just like you came out for this one. So the first thing I actually wanted to do was I was thinking that I should talk about what themes I've been hearing at the conference and in the case studies and try to connect that to my work on understanding and measuring the impact of co-ops on communities. And I'm going to try to, I think I can do that. I know if I move from this mic, you don't hear me anymore. So if I look like I'm doing gymnastics, it's just so I stay at the mic. So my first topic, and of course it's obviously the marginalization part, is one close to my heart because that's a lot of what I work on, is why and how co-ops have helped marginalized groups. But I put need there first because actually most of the case studies, everybody started out with some kind of need. And that's really, when I explain to people what co-ops are, that's usually what I start with, that it's a group of people who came together because of a need and tried to do something about that need in a collective, some often non-hierarchical way among a group of equals. So I think we need to remember that, especially in this day and age. I think a lot of our main speakers have also talked about how much the need is even growing now to do something more with community development and business development, et cetera. So to remember that co-ops are one of our main vehicles for addressing need and bringing people together who all want to address the same need. I think that's sort of our starting point, and maybe it's our ending point too, but there's probably lots of other stuff in the middle. And then for the marginalization part, there's some groups that actually have been either left out of the market or marginalized economically, socially, politically. And so often marginalized groups can use that exclusion to be a motivating factor to come together and find ways to address the needs that they've been excluded, the needs that reflect what they've been excluded from. And so again, co-ops have been, I think, a way for people, not always, but for marginalized people to use an economic strategy that can help them actually become less marginalized. And I won't get to talk a lot about my work on African American co-ops, but again, most of the history of African Americans using the co-op model has been because we've been discriminated against economically as well as socially, and often have pulled ourselves into the co-ops as a way to make up for the fact that the market and the mainstream economy don't accept us or won't. And even some of the other co-op groups who I haven't studied yet, but I'm sure Latinos and even Native Americans have had similar issues. The second one, which may not or may be related to the first bullet on champions, also came out a lot in the talks we've had up here, but also when I was reading the case studies. And again, that one I added affinities, trust, and social energy because I really don't believe in the notion that any co-op had just one champion. I actually don't believe any business just had one person either, but we won't get into that one. But the champion also often were champions, right? Even if we associate some of these co-ops with one person who pushed it through, that person usually had a team. If it was a man, he often had a wife and a family behind him. If it was a woman, she usually works in teams. It might have been a group. So again, it's this affinities, people who had a strong sense that we can do this and pushed it, but did it within some kind of group. Again, putting trust in there, and what one of my colleagues, Curtis Haynes, has always called social energy. And actually, I noticed some of the new research that's coming out that talks about how sustainable co-ops are. They haven't actually called it social energy, but they've been talking about the fact that co-ops have that affinity, trust, and energy of people working together, people who want to make it work, the sweat equity, that they're putting that in, and that's one of the excess factors of production that actually make the co-op sustainable and make it work. And so if you think about what we've heard so far in the case studies, there was always an element both of the champions, but also this element of people really putting their heart and soul, their energy into an economic project, and that's what sort of was the tipping point. That's what made it really work. Financing and capitalization. It's on my problems list as well as my themes list, because it's both a huge challenge, but also a fabulous asset. Again, if you look at all the case studies, most of them had all different kinds of ways to do the financing. And so the notion of being creative, right, about whether we put in tuppence a week in the Rochdale example in the 1844s, or whether we're paying, in $50 installments to be a member of isthmus. It wasn't $50, was it? But anyway, you know what I mean. It was $50, right? Anyway, the notion again that we've got different ways to make the financing work. We're looking more toward how to meld the public finance with private, and that's actually one of the things I was going to try to ask the mayor, but we didn't have time for, because you know some of the European models are very much about the public-private matching of funds and matching of efforts. Even some of the Canadian, particularly the Quebec models, are a lot about using public money or even union pension money for co-op development, that kind of thing. So again, some of the strengths we can see are the different varieties and ways that the financing has been either solved or finessed, right? And we've capitalized in a lot of different ways, sometimes in ways that have been very empowering to the actual co-op members, sometimes in ways that are empowering to the neighborhood or the city because we've invited them to be involved in the capitalization, right? And sometimes, unfortunately, not so well when we've gotten into too much debt and then the co-op can't get out of it, which is why I said it's also going to be in my problems list. The democratic practice and the learning, again, I'm not going to say too much about that one because that one usually is the obvious one we talk about the most. One of the things when I study worker co-ops in particular, though, is the focus on the word practice, right? So it's not just democracy in terms of one person, one vote, and everybody gets a chance, but it's actually the practicing of democracy. So actually being there, casting your vote, or being in the conversation, or getting your voice heard, that's even more important. And some co-ops, again, are much better at doing that than others. We started to talk about, but never got a good conversation here about what happens when you get really big, right? Does that vote really just become symbolic if you vote at all, right? I mean, I do that with my credit union, right? I'm involved with some huge credit union in DC that actually gives me really good service, but half the time I throw away the ballot because I don't even know the people who are running, right? But here I am. I'm a huge proponent of grassroots economic development and democratic participation and, you know, voices for the voiceless. So I actually, one year I was determined I was going to vote, right? I said, okay, this is ridiculous. You have to at least say you voted in your credit union vote, right? Well, but then I looked at the thing and I knew nobody. I didn't even understand what their issues were because they gave a little platform or bio. So I did vote. But then I did the other thing that I also yelled at people about. I just voted to vote. I didn't vote with any meaning, right? And I used to have lots of arguments with people, you know, about getting people, you know, putting people in vans and bringing them to the voting booth. And I've always said that's not real democracy, right? Just because you got them to the voting place and had them push the lever. But if they didn't have any say in who the candidates are, if they don't know what the issues are, then it's not real democracy. So, you see, I have my own contradictions. Yet, it is an issue, it's a good issue, it's a good theme, but it's also still something we need. If we're really talking about real democracy, real democratization, we do need to think about the practice part and the learning, because for me, you can't really have a real democracy if we're not learning and relearning and continuing to learn from our mistakes, learn from what we've already voted on, learn about new things, new ways to do it, new practices we can engage in, et cetera. So to me, democracy and learning, democracy and practice are all together. Linkages, we've also talked a lot about and come up a lot. And what I mean by that is when you link and network one co-op with another co-op, one co-op with other community activities, one co-op with regional activities and national activities. So again, a lot of the case studies talked about either how another co-op helped a co-op or how one co-op then got more involved in the co-op movement or connected with some regional group or created a regional group, or the connection between a credit union and a grocery co-op, or a credit union and a housing co-op, or whether the credit unions can be involved with helping another business, local business. So those issues, again, have come up a lot, but they're not, we haven't really solved them yet, and we need to think about them more thoroughly. In some of the work I'm doing on trying to measure impact, that's one of the things I'm asking. what are those linkages? Are there meaningful linkages? Are there ways that the linkages are built in because you're a co-op? Does your business really think more closely about that? You know, the Mondragon, which we talk about a lot, does have in its bylaws and principles that 10% of its profits are going to go to community development, right? So even in the worker co-op movement here in the U.S., we're having that discussion right now. So should 10%, actually, we're thinking about 5%, should 5% of every worker co-op's profits go to developing other worker co-ops? And what would that mean? Is there a national fund it would go to? Is it, or do they just have to do it in their own neighborhood or what? But again, that notion of is there a real linkage? Is it institutionalized in some way? Does it happen naturally and thoughtlessly, or is it really planned and strategic? And then the enabling institutions, I can't remember who said that today, but again, it's not just a notion of whether you have any linkages or how you connect to your community, but also are there a set of sort of very strategic enabling institutions, enabling processes and motions that are happening in community that will both support the co-op, but also even be feeding people into co-ops and feeding people into being more creative about their co-ops. The multiple sectors is really easy. We already saw from all the different breakouts and case studies that co-ops are in every area. One of the reasons I put it there was because I'm often asked, so what's the sector that's most conducive to co-ops? And especially public officials ask me that, and I actually hate that question. Because I actually have not found a sector that's not conducive to co-ops. So when I'm asked, isn't it easier to do it when you don't need any money for equipment? Or isn't it easier to do it when you have such and such a population or whatever? And, sometimes it's easier under certain circumstances, but I really haven't found a sector, so my favorite example, of course, is sex workers in San Francisco, which most of you probably know about, lusty ladies. But, the Peep Show, they started out wanting to unionize similar to union cab, right? They actually won their union fight, after 2 years, and then realized it didn't help because the owner now didn't want a union shop and he was going to sell. So they bought the company with the sex workers, the bouncers, and the custodians. Bought the company, right, and run it themselves. They rotate the two madam positions. The madam is basically the manager position. They rotate that every 6 months so not to wear anybody out. It's a peep show. There's no touching. There's a window. It's just dancing. But the other thing that I found out, and this would go back to some of my research on African Americans in co-ops, is when I talked to the black women in that co-op, one of the reasons they were really excited about being members of that co-op was because they actually got treated 1,000 times better than in any of the other peep shows, dance situations that they were in, because Lusty Ladies treats everybody equally and with dignity. So it doesn't matter whether you have blonde hair or black kinky hair. It doesn't matter if your body is really skinny or a little curvy. You get the same amount of time in the single window, which is where you make the most tips. You get the same amount of hours of work. You get to be yourself, etc. And so there's all kinds of things about human dignity and work and conditions and things like that, that even, as I say, in a peep show, being in a co-op is better. So I don't know of a sector where being in a co-op isn't better than not being a co-op. I mean, if you all want to argue with me, you can. But anyway, it's multi-sectoral. And then sustainability and failure. Actually, I heard a lot more about failure last night at our little dinner than I did today, though I know there's a session on failed food co-ops. And sustainability, I actually do mean both economic sustainability and environmental sustainability. So I'll start with the economic sustainability. And we have heard a lot, even the mayor from Madison talked about what he thought made sustainable co-ops, his 3, whatever. I wrote them down, but now, of course, I can't remember them. But one was attention to the business model, right? I think one was education or something. I don't know. Anyway, you all remember what he said. So sustainability is really important, and it is one of the killers. So we have some co-ops that manage to last a long time, often because the members are just tenacious, right? We have some co-ops that really don't last very long at all, and we call them failures. I put failure in quotation marks because I actually don't believe there's ever a total failure of a co-op effort. And the reason why I don't believe that is because, back to my practice and learning, just the process of putting a co-op together, being out there trying to do a co-op, trying to work together with other people, so much stuff is learned. So it might not have economically been able to keep going, but people gained all kinds of skills that they never had before, both in that particular business, but also in association matters, how to come together, how to work together, how to do consensus, how to get your voice heard, how to practice democracy, etc. Often you come out with all kinds of skills you didn't have before. The fact of a group of people who didn't work together before trying to work together. So there's all kinds of things that you end up in the end, so it wasn't a failure. The other thing that happened, especially from my research with African American co-ops, often the failures are from sabotage. It's not actually anything anybody did wrong in terms of the company. It's that outsiders just refused to let that co-op survive. So they did everything they could, between removing financial support, to burning down your building, harassing the members, putting people out of their homes, so they're homeless, so they can't use the co-op or go to the co-op or whatever. Not being able to find an insurer, so I can give you lists and lists and lists of those kind of things. And so to me, that's not a failure. You were a subject of harassment, and sometimes violent reaction, and sometimes unfair competition. So then the question is, how do we shore ourselves up from that? And that's sort of a whole nother question, and that's partly the subject of a second book I'm trying to finish. But again, so sustainability and this notion of when aren't you sustainable, and why aren't you sustainable, and therefore what lessons can we learn for the next time? So again, even these quote-unquote failures aren't failures because they teach us so much about what to do the next time and how to proceed the next time. Are you giving me time?
We're out of time.
Okay. Oh, I'm out of time. Okay, well, can I just go? I'll just show you my... problems. I had like 10 reasons why co-ops are community development, but you can ask me about that in question and answer. So my problems: back to capitalization, orientation, training, and education, distrust ideology, that excessive competition, and do you have a business plan, racism and patriarchy, class and gender inequality, the fact that we don't do deep analysis of co-ops, we just do these little feel-good descriptions. That's a real pet peeve of mine, and we don't always have the right policies and politics in place. Thank you.
Okay, our final?
I'm going to encourage you to very fast.
Okay, very fast. Michael Swack is professor at the University of New Hampshire, where he is the director of the Center for Social Innovation and Finance. He's been working for 30 years plus in the fields of economic development, finance, and development banking. He's published extensively on the issues of economic development, development finance, community investment, and mission-related investment. And I will let you go ahead and give your talk.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I see about half of you are still awake. That's a good sign. So my wife asks me, so what are you going to talk about down in Philadelphia? What's the talk about? And I said, scale, infrastructure, networks, systems. She looks at me and says, "You're kidding, right?" I said, "No, what's wrong?" She said, "You expect anyone to stay awake if that's the topic?" So I don't really know. And then I looked at it again. I said, scale, infrastructure, networks, sins. We're going to talk about sins today. You know, I can't resist starting with how I got into this work, and most of my work is in the area of finance. I've been involved in community development finance for a long time, startup with a number of organizations, but it really goes back to Madison, Wisconsin. There really is sort of a funny theme here. I also went to the University of Wisconsin as an undergraduate and had my first job there, really. How many people here from Madison? Well, you're still, there used to be a lot more. They all left. Only like 3 left. And so I worked initially while I was still an undergraduate, for an organization called Madison Community Cooperative, which I understand still exists, right? We primarily developed student cooperative housing. Students lived in it, but so did other people. So I was there during a time when we really grew. We bought a lot of new houses in the time I was there. And I got to be there because I lived in a cooperative house, and every cooperative house had a member of the board. Sorry? Well, I lived in 2, actually. I lived at one at 240 Langdon Street, and then I lived at one at 244 Lake Lawn Place, which we called Lothlorien at the time. Is it still there? Anyhow, this story is about that house. I actually bought that house. And what happened, I was elected to the board when I was living at Lothlorien. And the reason I was elected to the board is because we had a house meeting, and we were told that we were required to have a member of the board. And you know, it's one of those things where in cartoons you see a lineup of people, and they say, we need 1 volunteer, and everyone else steps backward, and so you're the only one still standing there. So that was me. So I was still standing there, and I get to the board, and after being on the board about 8 months, the executive director leaves. They need a couple people to work, and they ask, would I be willing to work part-time? I was compensated at the princely sum of $100 a month, plus room in one of the cooperatives. And I was told that my job was to be on the lookout to purchase other housing for cooperatives. We were in a real growth mode at that time, although no one talked about it. So it's one of those things. You remember your first day on your first job? You didn't know what you were supposed to do, right? You go in, you sit down. Now, if your first job is one where you're the only employee, it's even harder, right? So I go in, and again, for those of you from Madison, our office was at St. Francis House at the time, in the basement. You know, churches had all these groups in the basement that were supposed to be doing good stuff. And, you know, not to date myself too much, but we had a typewriter, a mimeograph machine. Right? Who remembers what mimeograph machines smell like? There we go. That's the elderly part of the audience. Sorry. And a desk. You know, and we had a open the checkbook there. You know, there wasn't enough to pay me for another month even. So I'm figuring, what am I supposed to do? So I start reading the real estate ads. What else do you do if you're supposed to buy housing? And so after a few weeks on the job, I found an ad that looked pretty interesting. I gave the guy a call and went down and looked at the house, and I thought, this would be great. It was 244 Lake Lawn Place. This would be great. This would be great for cooperative housing. It was a woman's boarding house at the time. And, so I go back and I said, well, we've got to buy this house. Now, the guy was willing to sell it pretty cheap. It was $20,000 down on a land contract. I didn't know what a land contract was. I knew what $20,000 was and knew that we didn't have it. And so I went back and decided to do some research, stopped at the library on my way back and went into the business section and got out a book on corporate bonds. And I thought to myself, we're a corporation. I go back to the office and I read it, and the appendix of the book is an actual securities offering. It's a bond offering. And I thought, this is pretty cool, you know? So I go to the typewriter, I copy it word for word, replace our name with the name of the corporation that was in the model, call a board meeting and say, let's sell bonds. Now we talked about good boards before. Paul Soglin, by the way, the first election I ever voted in was to vote for Paul Soglin. I told him that. He said, was it worth it? I didn't answer. So I printed out, called a board meeting, and our very sophisticated board said, great idea. And so I said, how do we do it? So I said, what you do is here are the mimeograph copies, go out and get people to give you money. When they give you money, you fill in the amount, you date it, and you sign the bottom and bring the money back to me. And people are laughing at it, but this was like a true story. This is why I got into finance, by the way, afterwards. So, believe it or not, money starts coming in. Because we just needed a small amount for a down payment. And I'm in the office like 3 days later, and the phone rings, and it's our lawyer. He says, Mike, I've been hearing a story. I'm sure it's not true, but I'm calling you just to check this out. I said, sure. He said, someone said that you were selling bonds. And I said, yeah, that's true. So long pause at the other end. And he says, have you ever heard the term securities fraud? Actually, I had not heard the term securities. I knew what fraud was, but I didn't know what a security was at the time. But the end of the story is we bought the highway. What I essentially said to him is, look, people gave us the money. They gave us the money I told them exactly what we were going to do with it. I'd actually done the calculations, and the money that we were going to be collecting from people, there would be more than enough to cover whatever we had to pay. And so I said to him, I don't get it. The money was willingly given. The money was, we can repay it. There's no problem with it. Why is this illegal? I couldn't understand it. And I said to him, you're the lawyer. Figure out how it won't be illegal. And he did. I mean, what essentially he figured out, first of all, he said was, get all of those securities documents back, every one of them, and tear them up and throw them out. And then he essentially converted them to simple loan agreements. So that house was bought by going out in the community where people loaned us money as evidenced by a promissory note, and we got the down payment. And interestingly, the permanent mortgage was provided by First Wisconsin, which less than a year earlier had had its windows smashed in a riot. So that was Madison at the time, and I figured maybe I should learn more about finance. Well, let me fast forward a little bit. About 10 years later, I started a master's program with adult practitioners who worked in it, and one of my first students was a woman who came into our class the first month of classes and said her brother was being evicted from the manufactured housing park. That's the now politically correct term. They were called mobile home parks before. And that, they had no place to move. It was 13 families. They had no place to move. What were they going to do? And I suggested to her that maybe they could start a cooperative. The problem was in these manufactured houses, and it's true all over the country, is that people own their units, but they rent the land underneath them. The land is usually owned by investors. It may be a mom and pop, but increasingly, believe it or not, these properties are owned by real estate investment trusts. And they're owned by real estate investment trusts because they're essentially cash cows. People pay money every month. You don't have to do anything. The maintenance on these is often terrible. It's a big money maker. And so real estate investment trusts buy them out. People pay because if they don't, they lose their homes. So there's a real motivation to do everything you can to pay. So we came up with the idea of forming a cooperative. The residents would form a cooperative. That cooperative would then borrow money to purchase the land. That became the first co-op. Where did the money come from? At the same time, we were organizing one of the first community development financial institutions. That term didn't exist yet, the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, and that became the first loan. The money that we got to make that first loan was from investors. One of the major investors was the Sisters of Mercy. The Sisters of Mercy, by the way, still use a lot of their pension money to invest in communities through institutions like community development financial institutions. Fast forward, there are now over 100 of them in New Hampshire. It's a significant part of the market. The market realizes it because to buy into a cooperatively owned home park as opposed to an investor-owned park costs you more money now because the market values it higher. Not surprising, though. Think about it, right? If you have security, you'll pay more for that security. But it's still true that the rents, so to speak, even though they're paying it to themselves, are significantly lower. There are also significant social benefits. One of the most interesting stories for writing something, I was interviewing a woman to talk about, I think, democracy. I was interviewing a woman who lived there. And the first question was like, how do you like living here? Seems like a pretty good question. I mean, really, it's the only important question. How do you like living here? And she said, it's pretty good. And I said, what's pretty good about it? And she said, well, let me tell you a little story. She said, this woman was probably 70 years old. She said, you know, the interesting thing to me is it's the first time in my entire life I've ever participated in an institution that it was a democratic institution. I said, really? She said, yeah, think about it. She said, I was born into a family. My father made all the rules. My family was not democratic. Was yours? She said, then I went to school. The school told me what to do. They told us we were a democratic country. I don't remember ever deciding anything there. On Sundays, my family went to church. We did what the church said. There was no democracy there. I eventually graduated from high school. I got a job. I went to the job, and I did what I was told. That was my life. When I went to the first co-op meeting when we converted from an investor-owned to a cooperative one, was the first time I actually voted on something that directly affected my life, that I actually participated in an institution that was democratic. It was amazing. When I was driving home I was like scared. I was like driving home that day and thinking, my God, is my life like hers too? You know, what if it is? And I started thinking, better stop thinking about this because it's probably true for many of us. How many of us do participate? This model is interesting, and what I'm really getting at is trying to get at is the issue of scale. I really believe we have to think bigger. Big is good. Scale does matter. Why does it matter? We do a lot of stuff well, but we don't meet the need. Scale means providing services to a large number of people, including low and moderate income people. It means providing services to a significant percentage of those who actually need it. It means being able to leverage size to improve results. It means having enough capital to develop new products and services. It means being significant enough to have a voice with the legislature and being able to actually affect the market. So what are the new models? I know we don't have a lot of time and we're running late. So let me talk about ROC USA. ROC USA is the scale, infrastructure, networks, systems example, but there are many that could be like it. So we've taken this 100 in New Hampshire and say, why not elsewhere? Okay, another big mistake we make in community development and also cooperatives. When you're growing scale, replication is not a good strategy. That's what we've found. But in the nonprofit world, someone does something great in San Francisco, do it in Philadelphia. But you know what? That's not how for-profit companies grow. Also in nonprofit financing, right? You have a project, they say, we'll fund you for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, you're on your own. Just the opposite in the for-profit sector. In the for-profit sector, proof of concept, demonstrate profitability for 3 years, then there's big money invested. That's when the big money comes. When you develop the proof of concept. In our field, that's when the money disappears. It doesn't make any sense. The systems we operate under don't make any sense. It's good to grow. We should be bigger because we should serve the needs of people who have those needs. So in ROC USA, we decided, let's expand. Let's raise big money. Let's grow 30 states. Let's look at how others do it. And we looked at a very interesting model that was, funny enough, right down the street from us. Literally right down the street. I mean, literally on the same street. How many people here have heard of the company CCA Global Partners? Ann, keep your hand down. 3. 4. CCA Global Partners is a $10 billion a year company. It's bigger than Staples. It's bigger than OfficeMart. It's one of the biggest companies in the country. It's a cooperative. It's in Manchester, based in Manchester, New Hampshire, but with members all over the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Here's the model. CCA Global Partners is a series of small retail stores that bind together to be a cooperative. They do lighting, they do carpeting, they do bicycles. So someone this morning said, why can't a bicycle? Paul Soglin said, why not bicycles? Well, there are several hundred bicycle stores that form the biking solution. They're all serviced by a set of service companies that do all the backroom stuff for them. If you own a bicycle store, probably you know a lot about bicycles. You probably know nothing about marketing, accounting, all the management stuff. What CCA Global does through its service companies, which are owned by the cooperatives, is it packages these companies into a cooperative and then provides all the services, including financing, marketing, access to materials to do it, and purchasing power. This is what Rock USA model is based on. The Rock USA model is, let's put all these co-ops together. When these co-ops are together, then we're going to provide, we've started an LLC financing company that provides financing to any co-op in the 30 states that needs it. We've put together a network of 10 technical assistance organizations across the United States that develop a pipeline. And online, you go online, and we're developing a platform. This is what CCA does. Everything is done through the system. You can buy insurance, price is already negotiated. Need management training, it's available online. Need marketing material, best practices are available online. You're a member, you have it. That's what we need for co-ops. There is a precedent. Like Jessica said, any sector, pick it. We're doing it in childcare now. We've put together a large childcare cooperative that's comprised of childcare cooperatives, individually owned ones, home ones, everything. What do they not do well? All the stuff we do. Compliance, basic accounting systems, advertising their openings, training for their background checks, training for their employees. There are tremendous opportunities right now if we look at the technology, we look at infrastructure, and we form networks. Why all these individually, vertically integrated institutions that have to do everything themselves? Why does every food co-op pretty much have to invent itself how to do it? Why don't we have a national food co-op where everything is available online? Management training, group purchasing, everything. There are tremendous opportunities in the cooperative world today. We don't think big enough. That's the problem. We don't think big enough. So I'll end with one last bond story in terms of thinking big enough. This is under the category of everything comes back. Over the past 6 months, I've been working on, for the Department of Treasury, some of you may know, there's going to be a new bond program that will ensure bonds issued by community development financial institutions. It's a $4 billion program that will provide insurance to essentially sell into the market to get cheap long-term money. Much of this money can go to finance co-ops. I thought I'd never see the day, but here, 35 or some years later, bonds are actually coming to pass. Thanks very much for your time.
We are very tight on time. We also have Representative Chaka Fattah coming, and out of respect for him, I think we have time for just one question. So, please.
Does your model encompass the notion of having cities, other public entities that purchase huge amounts of property. Where am I supposed to press? Hello? Nothing working. Does your model encompass going to municipalities, counties, other governments, and suggesting that they contract with co-ops for their products? You talk about other nonprofit institutions. I'm wondering about governments.
The short answer is yes. So we do look at city and county governments. Actually, we're trying to do this in multiple cities: Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Washington D.C., and we're certainly talking to local governments and D.C. the federal government, as well as universities and hospitals. The nice thing about universities and hospitals, especially nonprofit ones, is that they have somewhat fewer restrictions on how they make their purchasing decisions. Sometimes when it's a public entity, there's bidding laws that actually don't make a whole lot of sense. So you're not allowed to take into account. You're supposed to buy in some public laws. It depends on the locality. You can pass supportive policy, but in many cases you're just supposed to take the lowest price, even though if you're paying a penny less for that good that's coming in from China or Mexico, what have you, those people aren't paying taxes into your system. So if you actually looked at the total cost, obviously it'd be cheaper to buy locally. So that's a policy issue. But yes, we do work with governments as well as universities and hospitals.
All right. I think that concludes this panel. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And also, they've raised many issues. I'm sure all three of them would be delighted to speak more about any of the issues